Hi, in this video we're going to make a file dropper for our interface so the user can drag or drop, in this case a PNG or JPEG file, onto the file dropper and it will load it onto the interface. But you could use this for any file type. To start, we're going to set our interface to have a size of 800 by 600. Next we're going to add a panel to our UI. This will be the file dropper and we'll position this at 80, 140, and we'll give it a width of 450 by 320. We're going to change the name of it, so I'll click on it over here, I'll press F2. We're going to call it PNL Drop Zone. Now we're going to add an image control to the interface. We'll right click, select the image, and let's reposition this one. So this is going to be at 550 and 150, and we'll give it a size of 230 by 310. And we're just going to change the name of this one to IMG. Okay, now let's move on down to our script. We'll grab a reference to our drop zone panel, and we're going to start by drawing the panel's appearance with that dotted line that we saw earlier and the text in the middle. So we'll add a paint routine for the panel. Next we'll get the area of the panel into a variable called A. So I'm using getLocalBounds to get the area of the panel, and by passing 2 in here I'm indenting the area on all sides from the outside of the panel by 2. So next we're going to set the color. We're using colors.widthAlpha and we're using the text color property of the panel, and we're giving it an alpha value of 0.05, so really transparent. Next we're going to check if the mouse is hovering over the panel. This is actually going to be set later on, and we're going to check that it's a file that's being dragged over the panel, and if it is, then we are going to fill in a rounded rectangle, and we're going to use the panel's border radius to get the roundedness of the panel. So if we go to the panel's properties, scroll down here, we can see the border radius is currently set to 6, and we're just going to leave it at 6. That's fine for this video. Let's change the text color though, since we're using that. Let's change that to a light grey color, so we'll do FF followed by 6 Cs. Okay, that border that we're seeing here, this is created automatically. We haven't hit F5 yet, so our paint routine hasn't taken effect. Okay, so this is a filled rounded rectangle, so that means it's going to fill the area. So if I hit F5, we're not actually going to see anything yet, because this is only going to show when we are hovering a file over the panel. But if I just comment out this if statement, we can see what it's going to look like. So I'll hit F5. So it's just drawing a light grey box. So let's re-enable that if statement, and we'll see it in action in a little while. So now we're going to set a color again. Again, we're using the text color with alpha, and we're setting it to 0.5, but we're adding 0.5 multiplied by this .data.hover. So basically when we're hovering over the panel with a file, it's going to equal 1, and when we're not hovering, it's just going to be 0.5. The next thing we're going to do is draw a dashed rectangle, and to do that we're going to use the path tools in HISE. So first we're going to create a path using content.createPath. So a path is just a line between points. So the simplest path would be 2 points and a line, so that's the straight line, but you can do all sorts of interesting paths. In this case we're going to create a rounded rectangle, so we don't have to specify the individual points for that because HISE already has that kind of simple path built in. So to create that, we're just going to write p.addRoundedRectangle. We're going to pass in the area and pass in the radius that we want. Again, we're using the panel's border radius property. Now we need to specify the type of stroke that we want to use. So to do that, we create an object called stroke, and we can pass in an end cap style. In this case, I've chosen rounded. We can pass in a joint style. I've chosen beveled, and we can pass in the thickness of the stroke. So that's going to be the thickness of the line. I'm using 1, but we can play around with that. If you want to see what options are available for the end cap style and the joint style, we can have a look in the HISE documentation. So I've gone to the draw path function in the documentation, and we can see the various options we have here, but square or rounded for the end cap style, and mitered, curved or beveled for the joint style. Because we're drawing a dashed line, it doesn't really make a lot of difference which ones we go with, but I've chosen to go with rounded and beveled. But you can play around with those to see what you prefer. So now we need to take our path and from it create a stroked path. So that's going to be a path with a dashed line. To do that, we use p.createStrokedPath, and this returns a new path which we're going to store in this variable sp. We pass in our stroke, and then we pass in an array that defines the lines and the gaps. So we're saying we'll have a line of 5 and then a gap of 10. In a minute, we'll take a look at this in action and we'll play around with some different values there. All we need to do is draw the path. So to do that, we write g.drawPath, pass in our stroked path, pass in the area, and again we pass in the stroke. Let's hit F5 and take a look at it. So there we go, there's our dashed path. We can change the thickness. Let's try putting that to 5. Hit F5, we get a thicker line. Maybe 2 is better. 2 looks pretty good. If we zoom in on this path, we can see that these have a rounded end. If we change the end cap style to but and hit F5, we can see that they change their style there. Okay, let's play around with the pattern of dashes and gaps. So we've got it set to 5 and 10. If I change this to 5 and 5, we'll see now that the gaps are smaller. Also notice that the corner up here isn't even. This one looks alright, this one looks different, and that's just something you have to experiment with to get the corners to look the way you want. I found 5 and 10 is pretty good, but as you can see, it's still not perfect. So it doesn't just have to be 2 numbers in here. We can keep going to specify a larger pattern of dashes and gaps that we'd like to use. Generally though, you want to do it in pairs of dash size and gap size so that you get the pattern repeating evenly. But you can put an odd number in there if you want. So let's put 8 and 15 and we'll hit F5 and we can see now we have a different pattern with 5, a gap, 10, a larger gap, 5, a gap, 10, a larger gap, etc. So yeah, we could just keep going with that, but I'm just going to clear that out now and we'll go back to 5 and 10 and back to a line thickness of 1. The last thing to do is to draw the text in the middle. So we'll start by setting the font. I'm going to set it to Oxygen with a size of 18. Then we'll define the color we want to use. Again, I'm going to use the text color and I'm using the with alpha function here to give it an opacity of 0.9. And then finally we'll draw the text. I want it to be centered, so we're using g.drawAlignText, putting in the text that I want to show, passing in the area, and passing in the centered alignment. Okay, the next thing to do is to actually add the drag and drop functionality. So we'll scroll up and below our PNL drop zone declaration, we're going to define a file drop callback. So to do this, we write PNL drop zone dot set file drop callback, and then we have to pass in the callback types we want. There's quite a few to choose from, but in this case we're going to go for all callbacks. Then we need to pass in the file extensions that we want to allow the user to drop onto the panel, so they can only drop files of a certain type. So I'm putting .png and .jpg, but you can put whatever you want there and just separate them with a comma. If you only want one, then you only need to put one and you don't need to worry about the comma. And finally, we need to give it a callback function that's going to be triggered when the user drags a file over or drops a file onto the panel. So I'm calling the function onPNLDropZoneFileDrop. Okay, so let's declare that function. So we've got inline function onPNLDropZoneFileDrop, and we're passing in obj. So that's an object that is given to us by HISE that we can access within this function. Okay, let's take a look at the contents of that object. So we'll write console.print trace obj. So I'm going to clear the console. We won't see anything until we drop a file over here. So here I'm going to drag an image file over and we can see the output there. So it's saying the X and Y position of the mouse where I'm dragging the image. So if you want to do fancy animations based on the mouse, you can do that. It says if we're hovering or not over the panel. So if I go outside the panel, it's false. If I go onto the panel, it's true. It says, have we dropped the file yet? That's going to be false until I release the mouse. And then it's giving us the file path there. It says file name, but it's actually the whole file path. So if I drop it, drop is now true. But we're not doing anything with the file yet, so no magic has happened. So that was a JPG file I was dragging over, and we are allowing PNG and JPG. If I try and drag a different file, so here's a Lua file, if I try and drag that over, you can see nothing happens. It just completely ignores it because we haven't allowed that one through. But if I add Lua in here, so we'll just write that in and hit F5. Now if I try and drag the Lua file on there, it's going to update again. Okay, and let's undo that. So we're just going back to the images. Okay, now we want to set that hover property of our panel. So that's the one we're using here, this.data.hover. We want to set that based on if the user is currently hovering a file over the panel. So to do that, we'll write this.data.hover equals obj.hover, so that's coming from this obj object, and not obj.drop. So once they drop the file, we consider that as no longer hovering a file over the panel. After that, we want to repaint the panel so it updates and can take into account if we're hovering a file over the panel. So let's see what that looks like. We'll hit F5 and we'll drag that file across again. So as I'm hovering over, you can see it lights up. Take it away. And now if I drop it, it's going to be no longer hovering, so it will go away again. So at this point in the script, we don't want to do anything until the user has dropped the file. So we can just put a little return statement here. We'll say if they haven't dropped it yet, return. So everything that happens after this point has happened after the user has dropped the file. So what we're going to do first of all is we're just going to get a reference to the file. So we're going to take that obj.filename, and remember file name is actually the path to the file. And we're using filesystem.fromAbsolutePath and passing in that file path. So this is going to give us a file object. So we're not actually going to use the file in this tutorial, but most of the time when you're using a file dropper, you're probably going to want to get a reference to the file. So that's why I'm showing you how to do this. And we can just see that that's worked by printing it to the console. So we've got console.print file, that's this object here, .toString file.fullPath. So we're just going to print the full path. So let's drag our image on, we'll release, and it prints the full path. Okay, let's remove that because we don't need it anymore. So what we want to do here instead is we want to set the image to show the image that we've dropped. So we need a reference to our image component. So we'll right click on that, select create script variable definition, and we'll just scroll down and we'll put a comment here and paste that reference in. Okay, when we hit F5, we want the image to always be reset, always be cleared out. So we're going to write image or img.setImageFile. We're going to pass in an empty string and we're going to pass in true. The second parameter doesn't really matter in this case because we're not actually passing in a real image. Then back up in our file drop callback, we're going to do the same thing, img.setImageFile, but this time we're going to pass in obj.filename. And the capitalization is important here, so it's a lowercase f, uppercase n. And then we're going to pass in true, and this just tells HISE that we want to use the actual file, not some reference to it. And it doesn't really matter in this example, but in a more complicated project where you're loading in multiple images, that might be something you want to look into further. So now let's test it and see if it works. I'm going to drag our image onto the panel and release. And there we go, it's loaded our image into the image component. And when I hit F5, it should clear it out and reset it. There we go. So that's how you can create a drag and drop zone in HISE to allow your user to drop files onto the interface, and then you can do with them what you like. I hope you found this video useful. The project will be available for my higher tier Patreon supporters. I'll leave a link to that in the video description. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. That's all for this one, and I'll see you next time.